Evening. It's a little after 7:30. I think we're going to get started. I think there are a few more people trickling in, but well, you know, we'll get started. First, I want to welcome you all to Congregation Beth Am for our winter series, Jewish Philosophy Matters, or Jewish Philosophy Matters. I think it's going to work both ways. A nice double entendre. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Lupovitch, Harry Lupovitch. I'm a member here at Congregation Beth Am, and I read Torah here. I also am a professor of history at Wayne State University, director of the Cohn-Haddow Center for Judaic Studies at Wayne State University, which has the which is co-sponsoring the series, naturally. First, I want to make sure, does everyone have one of these handouts? We're going to be looking at some text this evening, and it'll be helpful to read along. Don't worry, I'm not going to call on anybody to read. I'll take care of all of that myself. So this is a four-part series, and the first three parts of the series are going to be lectures by me on the matters of Jewish philosophy, well, pre-modern Jewish philosophy. And the fourth lecture on Monday, January 26th, we have a very special guest, Professor Benjamin Pollack from Michigan State University, who was a professor. He's an expert in Jewish thought. I don't want to undersell what's coming before, but he's an actual expert in Jewish philosophy. I know Jewish studies, I know history, and I know a few things about it as well. But you know, the goal of the series is that the three lectures that I give will prepare you to be able to hear his lecture on the fourth week. Having said that, if you miss one, if you don't come to the ones, but you can each lecture is a sort of standalone proposition. So, but that's what the series is going to consist of. Now, during the course of the series, we're going to look at this very large subject, this question of Jewish philosophy, in different contexts. So we're going to begin this week with the philosophical mind of the Talmud, move next week to Maimonides, and then the late medieval or early modern Prague scholar, the Maharal. That's in week 3. That's the guy who made the golem. He's the one who was able to combine philosophy and mysticism. And then finally, modern Jewish philosophy in the fourth week with Professor Pollack. But this week we're going to begin with the philosophy of the Talmud and the rabbis. But before I do, I want to say a few words of general introduction and begin with the question, what do we mean when we say philosophy? I mean, we sort of generally know what philosophy is. I think philosophy, it's sort of like the way the Supreme Court describes pornography. We know it when we see it. We know when something is philosophical. It's not like pornography in any other way. That's, that's my analogy, simply for analogical reasons. So I think it's useful to begin by defining philosophy, but also distinguishing philosophy from two sort of related terms. One is theology, and the other is religion. All right, I want to begin that way just to make sure we know what we're talking about. Now, the word philosophy, the etymology, the literal meaning of the word philo in Greek means love. So Philadelphia means brotherly love. A philo-Semite is the opposite of an anti-Semite. Okay? The ancient Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria, his Hebrew name was Yedidia, which means love or camaraderie. Okay? The Saf part of philosophy is ideas or wisdom. So philosophy, in its most literal sense, means the love of ideas or the love of wisdom. That's what it means. It's in its most literal sense. But it's come to mean a lot more. When we talk about philosophy, generally speaking, as a term, we're talking about first about ideas that tend to be rational, that derive from our abilities to think logically and reasonably, to deduce ideas from other ideas. And secondly, when we talk about works of philosophy, we're talking about works about ideas that are organized systematically. When you read something philosophical, whether it's an ancient philosopher like Socrates or a modern philosopher like Buber, you expect to see something specific in this work of philosophy, an argument, a logical argument laid out. To speak or think or write philosophically means to think or speak or write systematically and logically and rationally. But in a broader sense, philosophy doesn't necessarily have to be that. There can be a mystical component or a non-rational component to philosophy as well. If you've ever read Plato, you know that Plato was a mystical thinker in addition to being a rational thinker, as opposed to Aristotle, who was simply rational. Now, theology means something a little bit different, although there is some overlap. The word theology, the thea part of theology means God, and logos means idea or study of. So theology can mean the study of God or the idea of God. So when we speak about theology, let's say the theology of Judaism or the theology of Christianity or Islam or whatever, we're talking about what does this particular set of wisdom or knowledge or ideas believe or claim about God. So in this sense, I would suggest that theology is a kind of subset of philosophy. Theological thinking, to the extent that it's trying to take a very difficult, a complex concept like God and the relationship between God and humanity or God and Israel, and trying to take that idea and understand it rationally and systematically. Theological thinking can often also be philosophical thinking. There's some overlap there, but they're not exactly synonymous or congruent, because oftentimes much of theology is not rational and not systematic. It can be more chaotic, it can be more mystical or speculative, so they're not exactly the same thing, but much of theology tends to be a subset of philosophy. Philosophy tends to be a more overarching term. Now, the term religion, I think, is the most different, it's very different from the other two. The way we use the word religion as a set of beliefs and practices and symbols and institutions tends to be a more modern construct. When we talk about our religion, or the concept of having a religion, is a modern concept in the sense that it was a response, it was an idea that was invented at a time when the alternative was possible. When in the last, probably sometime in the 16th or the 17th century, a time when one French philosopher called the crisis of unbelief. When there were more and more people who stopped believing in God and religion, or God and rituals, see, I had to use the word religion there to define it. When there were people who stopped believing, that was a time when those who continued to believe, or those who wanted to distinguish between believers and non-believers, defined the term religion as a very self-conscious construct. But what I mean is, if we went back in time about 500 years, let's say, to the Middle Ages, to the ancient world, and stopped someone in the street and said, "What is your religion?" they wouldn't know what you were talking about. In the ancient world, in the medieval world, for most people, even in the early modern world, and really until 2 centuries ago, for most people in the Western world, one's religion was simply one part of one's way of life. And it was almost inseparable from the rest of one's life. It's only the modern compartmentalized sense of identity which makes this notion of religion possible. By the way, the concept of religious and the concept of secular are invented almost simultaneously. Those are two terms born at the same moment of the same spiritual and intellectual crisis. So, philosophy or philosophical thinking can be an element of a religion, both in the modern and the pre-modern sense, in the same way that a theology is also an important component of a religion. Now, colloquially, when we use the word religion, really what we're saying, oftentimes when we use it, we're using it with the understanding that people from a long time ago had. Most of us aren't walking around going, when I talk about my religion, I'm talking about it, in self-conscious distinction from the rest of my life. We don't think that way. Most of us say religion simply is a set of practices and beliefs that we integrate into the rest of our lives as best as we can. Okay. Now, I define all these terms for you basically to introduce you to the notion that when we talk about the philosophy of Judaism or Jewish philosophy, here's the conundrum, or here's the trick we have. After a certain point, we have writings and thinkers who are writings that are clearly philosophical and thinkers who are clearly philosophers. Probably are beginning around the 7th or 8th century CE in Babylonia. Next week when we talk about the world of Maimonides, He had one precursor named Sa'adya Gaon. That's the time when Jews began to import the ideas of Greek philosophy and create a more systematic Jewish philosophy. Before that, there isn't very much in the way of Jewish philosophy. Now, there are two important exceptions to that rule, which may be exceptions that prove the rule, but they're certainly exceptions. There was the aforementioned Jewish philosopher of ancient Alexandria, Philo of Alexandria, who lived in the 1st century CE, and he was an individual who integrated, who wedded the ideas of Greek philosophy and Judaism. He was the first Jewish philosopher. The reason he's a sort of exception is outside the world of Alexandria, he had relatively little impact for a long, long time. And we don't even know how much impact he had on Jews in Alexandria, because most of what we know about the Jews of ancient Alexandria, we know from the writings of Philo. So, based on the writings of Philo, of course, as with most philosophers, he was the center of the world. Every Jew loved him and was a Jew exactly like him, but we don't know if that was actually true. In fact, much of Philo's voluminous works, and he wrote a lot about a lot of very interesting things, would have been lost to us entirely had they not been preserved for a variety of reasons which need not detain us here by the church. It was the church that preserved Philo, and centuries later, many Jews learned about this ancient Jewish philosopher from Christians. He was lost to Judaism for a long time. And the other exception is the Roman Jewish historian Josephus Flavius, who also wrote some philosophical works as well. But those two exceptions aside, Jewish scholars, Jewish thinkers prior to, let's say, the 7th or 8th century CE, were simply not that interested in philosophical thinking, nor were they very interested in theology for that matter. The central concern of Jewish scholarship, Jewish legal thinking, Jewish writing was not the larger ideas of Judaism, but rather Jewish law and how to observe it. In other words, for a long time, for the first 1,000 years after the Babylonian exile, the primary focus of Judaism and Jewish thinking was not orthodoxy, small o, what Jews should believe, but orthopraxy, what Jews should do. So, Shabbat, the thinking and writing about Shabbat was not the spiritual significance of Shabbat, not the philosophical concept of Shabbat, of rest, but, well, can we do this? Can we do this? Is this acceptable on Shabbat? Is this not? It's largely legal thinking. And so, when we look at a collection of legal writing like the Talmud, now the Talmud, for those of you who don't know, was part of this oral collection, oral discussion of Jewish law, which eventually was codified in the year 500 CE, long story short. 80% of what's in the Talmud is legal discourse, case and ruling, a legal case and a ruling. It is primarily a legal code embedded in a legal conversation. That's most of what's in the Talmud, but surrounding this large, extensive legal conversation are discussions that we can call philosophical. Within this large corpus of writing, the Talmud, as well as the Midrash, there are philosophical ideas floating around. And that's why, when we begin this week with the philosophical mind of the Talmud, it's important to note that there is no place in the Talmud that we can point to, oh, this is the section of the Talmud that deals with philosophy. There is no such section. There's no section in the Talmud that deals with ideas, that deals with concepts. Rather, there are concepts strewn throughout the Talmud. There are philosophical ideas strewn throughout the Talmud. And so, we can't talk about the Talmud as a philosophical work entirely or even partially, but the good news is, when you look through the Talmud, we can pluck these floating, these isolated bits of philosophical thinking, and from that we can extract a philosophical worldview, or what I call here the philosophical mind of the Talmud. But I want this to be very clear, because next week when we talk about Maimonides, Maimonides wrote books that were actually philosophical. Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed is a philosophical work. In Maimonides' Code of Jewish Law, the first section, the Book of Knowledge, is a work of philosophy. We don't have that in the Talmud. It's also an important point to make, because for a long time, one of the central criticisms of Judaism by its adversaries, by Christians, by pagans, was that Judaism lacks a philosophy. Judaism is an irrational or non-rational religion, or strictly arbitrary. And the defense, in response to that, there were those who said, no, it's not true. There are philosophical ideas. They're just sort of they're strewn around. What the Talmud really lacks, and what rabbinic literature lacked for a long, long time, is any kind of systematic organization of those philosophical ideas. But fortunately for us, we can sift through, we can find them, and in a very un-Talmudic way, what I've done for here is I've chosen some excerpts from the Talmud which are either overtly or implicitly philosophical in nature. Now that's another distinction as well. Since much of the Talmud is legal reasoning and legal argumentation, in order to fully understand the philosophical ideas of the Talmud, the way the Talmud embraces concepts and ideas, sometimes we have to accept the fact that a discussion which seems entirely legal, or a discussion which proceeds along, in legal ways for the most part, can eventually turn in a philosophical direction. Or we can extract, we can infer a philosophical teaching, a larger, broader teaching from a legal discussion. We're going to do that a couple times. And elsewhere, the philosophicalness of the Talmud is more overt. All right. Now, I can't give it all to you, it's just simply too big, but I decided this evening to give you a good sense of what there is in the Talmud in terms of philosophical thinking, to look at what we might call the philosophy big three. You take any philosophy course, certainly a Western philosophy course, there are three questions, or three categories, or three issues that philosophy tends to address, Jewish and otherwise. One is called, I'll tell you what the three are, and then I'll explain them, because these are words that simply do not occur in everyday speech. These are crossword puzzle words, if that. They're just arcane words. One is called ontology, one is epistemology, and one is teleology. I think I probably should have written them out. I didn't. All right. The first is ontology. It's written just like it's spelled, all O's. All right. Ontology means anything that ends with logy or ology is the study of something. Ontology is the study of existence. I know. What does that even mean, the study of existence? Sounds like something you talk about at a party. Oh, are we really here, How do we know that we're just one little cell on some great, fruit tree in the cosmos? The end of Men in Black or something like that. Ontology is the study of existence. Fortunately, it's easiest to define in terms of Jewish philosophy by example. Because in Jewish philosophy, when we talk about the study of existence, ask the question, what is there? Judaism comes down really to two ontological categories. Heaven, earth. This world and the world of God. Now, in fancy terms, we would say Judaism has a kind of ontological dualism. There are two states of existence, heaven and earth. Not everyone has that, by the way. If you're a naturalist philosopher, let's say like Karl Marx or Immanuel Kant, who didn't really believe in heaven, all there is, it's ontological monism. There's only one state of existence, only one thing, only one place people exist. So ontology is the study of existence, and in a Jewish context, ontology is really a fancy way of saying that Judaism believes that there's heaven and earth. Two categories of existence, two natures of being, the heavenly and the earthly. And either you're in one or the other, or as we'll see, you can be kind of a mixture. And the ontological questions that Judaism is going to ask is, how does one state of existence or one category of existence affect or interact with the other? How do we aspire or relate to heaven, and how does God manifest on earth? All right? That's ontology. Epistemology is a little easier to understand. Epistemology is the study of knowledge. So if ontology asks the question, what is there? What exists? Epistemology asks the question, how do we know what exists? How do we know what we know? The study of knowledge. And in a Jewish context, again, a Jewish context, epistemology for Jewish philosophy really comes down to two categories. There's that which we know through reason, through our mind's ability to figure things out, our senses, science, and there's that which is revealed to us by God. Reason, revelation. It's pretty simple when you think of it that way. And then the third is teleology. Teleology means the study of the end. Now, end here doesn't mean end as in beginning. It means end as in objective or aim. Teleology asks, what is the point of all this? Now, believe it or not, you may have had sort of teleological moments or teleological questions. If you've ever asked yourself, why should the meat of a cow be kosher and the meat of a pig not be kosher? Why can't we mix milk and meat? Believe it or not, that's a question that Jews have been asking for a long time. Now, if you want to know the answer, for those who tried to find the answer to that question, that's a teleological question. What is the purpose of the commandment to do such and such, or the commandment not to do such and such? Why? That's a teleological question. Now, as we'll see, the rabbinic term, and really the Jewish term for teleology, the Hebrew term is ta'amei ha-mitzvot, the reason or the purpose for the commandments. Why do we do? But we'll see that the whole endeavor of figuring out the why of the commandments wasn't there at the beginning. It's really in the Talmud where we'll be able to see a shift in mentality when suddenly rabbis begin to ask, well, now that we understand it, why do we do it? Why is a hard question to figure out. I mean, the kosher example is a great example. For 1,500 years, Jewish thinkers have been trying to figure out the why of kashrut. There have been a few attempts at an answer. There's still no answer. Now, the search for the answers, we'll see, is also part that has importance in and of itself. Okay. Let's look at these in a little bit more. Let's unpack these in a little bit more detail. Let's start with the ontology of Judaism, and like I said, ontology for Judaism means heaven and the earth, heaven and earth. So let's start with some basic notions. First of all, the basic notion in Judaism is that the realm of God, heaven, shamayim, is distinct and separate from the realm of this world. We exist in this world. God exists in that world. In fact, biblical scholars, mainly modern biblical scholars, looking through the stories of the Torah, they really reduce the stories of the Torah to ontological issues or ontological matters. The notion of a covenant, a contractual relationship between God and the Jews, one of its goals was to narrow the distance between heaven and earth. If you have a cooperative venture, if you have a contractual arrangement between God and the Jews, a heavenly being and an earthly being, it makes earthly beings a little bit more heavenly, and it makes a heavenly being a little bit more worldly. It narrows the gap. Similarly, the whole notion of kadosh and kedusha as defined in the book of Leviticus, more than anything else, is narrowing the gap between heaven and earth. I mean, think about it. In a very literal way, the book of Leviticus describes the building of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, with the Holy of Holies, a place for God to reside on earth. That's narrowing the distance between heaven and earth. That's a very ontological matter. It's reshuffling or altering the ontology of Judaism. Not that the two realms don't exist, but you can't make as clean a division. You can't say Jews are only here and God is only there, because clearly there's some intermixing between the two. Or, in a more metaphorical way, the whole notion that Jews act b'tselem Elohim, in the image of God. That's also altering the relationship between the worldly and the heavenly. So there are familiar moments that we know where there is this interaction. But I brought a couple less obvious examples where we see one of the things that Judaism is doing is enhancing or altering or redefining, well, defining the role of God in human affairs. A very ontological matter. Now, like I said, sometimes this very important philosophical question or quest is only implicit. You read it out of a text that doesn't appear philosophical at all. It doesn't appear to be speaking about anything about existence at all, but it strictly seems to be an ordinary legal text. Let's look at an example. Look at text number 1. Text number 1 comes from the Mishnah, an oral tradition of laws that was codified in 200 CE and was the basis of the Talmud. And there's a tractate in the Mishnah called Sanhedrin, which deals more than anything else with court procedure, juridical law. Well, at least this one chapter does. And chapter 4 of Tractate Sanhedrin it distinguishes two kinds of trials, or two kinds of court cases: a monetary case, a civil case, and a capital trial. Now, capital in the ancient world included criminal, because most crimes, or there were many crimes that were punishable by death, at least theoretically. But really, they're talking about the difference between a civil trial and a capital trial. But in this particular chapter, they outline for us what are the differences between the way a person is tried for a civil crime and for a capital crime. Let's look at some of them, all right? What is the difference? Ma bein dinei mamonot ledinei nefashot. What is the difference between civil and capital cases? Now, I'm going to read some of these specific examples. Let's see if you can glean the pattern, because the pattern is going to point us to the philosophical conclusion that rabbis of the Talmud are going to draw subsequently. Okay? Civil cases are tried by 3 judges, capital cases by 23. Civil cases may be opened by arguments. Sorry for the table. Opened by arguments either for acquittal or conviction, while capital charges must be opened by arguments for acquittal, but may not be opened by arguments for conviction. I should just say as a procedural footnote that the system here is the judges were also the lawyers. So if you were a judge, you were assigned either to argue for the prosecution or to argue for the defense, and you were also the jury. So the judges were also the lawyers and also the jury. But you know, you would be assigned to argue one or the other. All right? Civil suits may be decided by a majority of 1, either for acquittal or conviction, whereas capital charges are decided by a majority of 1 for acquittal, but at least 2 for conviction. Decisions regarding civil cases may be reversed both for acquittal and for conviction, while decisions regarding capital charges may be reversed for acquittal only, but not for conviction. Regarding civil cases, all including students, like the assistants to the jurors, observing the case may argue for or against the defendant. Regarding capital charges, anyone including observing students may argue in his favor but not against him. Are you seeing a pattern here with regard to the capital cases? If you look at it, it looks here like, as you keep going, capital trials are rigged in favor of the defendant, of the accused. It was much harder. It's very difficult to convict someone of a capital crime than to acquit them. You know, I think the one that really defines it is, you know, you need a simple majority to acquit, simple majority plus 1 to convict. But if all 23 judges, vote to acquit, the person goes free. If they all vote to convict, the person goes free. They didn't want to make a mistake. Now, that's the basic legal setup here, but the question is why? And here we get to the philosophical element here. And here we get to an understanding of how God, as a heavenly being, is involved in human affairs. The reason they were willing to, they were clearly more willing to risk letting a guilty person go free than sentence an innocent person to death, because they knew that if a guilty person went free, God would get him. You know, to quote Maude and Archie Bunker, God would get him. They were willing to bank on that fact. But they also knew that if they sentenced an innocent person to death and executed that person, A lot more difficult for God to help out in that situation, because occasionally, you know, once in a great while you'd have some resurrection going on, but it didn't happen as a general part of life. But the guilty person would ultimately meet justice. The innocent person would not. So for the most part, what we have here is justice in human hands, but God is still part of this justice system. When it comes to dealing with capital criminals, there is this reluctance to sentence and convict anyone. And in practice, the Talmud tells us that it was rare that anyone was convicted of a capital crime. There was one court that in 70 years, they convicted one person of a capital crime, and this court was known as the hanging court. It never happened. But you see why? Because they knew that they had the God backup. But that it tells us something about a larger view of the universe. Okay. Let's look at text number 2. Let's look at another example about the relationship between the human role in justice or deciding cases or evaluating right and wrong versus God's role. Now the first one, it showed a clear divine role. This case is going to tell us something a little different. Now, like I said, this is a legal argument which seems very arcane and very mundane. Don't worry, we're going to get to some more profound stuff in a minute. But it tells us something very interesting. Okay? This happens to do with the laws of lost articles. Okay? There's a tractate, there's a section of the Mishnah, and then the Talmud Bava Metzia. One chapter of this section talks about if you find a lost article, how do you know if you have to return it or not? You could call this section, tractate, finders, keepers, losers, weepers, maybe. All right? Elu mitziot shelo, elu chayav lahachriz. These are the lost articles where if you find them, you can keep them. These are the lost articles where if you find them, you have to make a declaration and help whoever lost it. All right? And then there's a whole list. But then Rabbi Yehuda, the editor of the Mishnah, he summarizes and says, Kol davar sheyesh bo shinui chayav lahachriz. If you find something that has a distinguishing mark, you have to return it. If you find something without a distinguishing mark, you can keep it. You find $100 in the street, just a $100 bill, you can keep it. If you find a wallet with a $100 bill in it, with a driver's license in it, that you have to return. That's one principle. Now, they're going to later add a second principle as well. It isn't only if it has a distinguishing mark. Elsewhere they say, if you find something of great value, even if it doesn't have a distinguishing mark, you still have to return it. So maybe my $100 is one thing. If you find $10,000 in the street, or $1 million, even if it's just, an undistinguished load of bills, you have to return that too, or at least try to. Eventually they extract a larger principle called yeush. Now the Hebrew word yeush can mean despair. It can also mean abandonment. So the Talmud's notion is, and this isn't the philosophical part, this is still the legal part. The Talmud's notion is, they're generalizing here now. All of these specific cases tell us that if you find a lost article, and when you find it, if you can be reasonably certain that whoever lost it has given up hope, has despaired, has abandoned the possibility of ever retrieving it, then you can keep it. But if you find something and and it's reasonable to assume that the person is still looking for it, then you have to return it. Personal example, all right? This is this wedding ring. It's actually not I've only been married once. This is my second wedding band, because my first wedding band was one size bigger, and I was playing football in Lake Michigan, and I threw the ball and it went flying off my finger and landed right in the lake, all right? And I dove in after it, knowing full well that if I didn't find it in the next, 5 seconds, it was gone forever. I didn't, it was gone. I mean, I looked for it for 45 minutes, which is a real exercise in futility, because this wasn't a lake, this was Lake Michigan. It was gone. Now, I always imagined, years later or whenever, that, at some point, there was someone on the beach with one of those metal detectors looking for quarters or dimes in the sand, and they found that ring, and what a day that must have been. You're looking for a quarter and you find a band which is actually worth something. But the question is, according to this notion of yeush, of despair, of abandonment, that person could have kept it. Even though it's something of value, even though well, I don't think it's very distinguished, but even though it's something of value, that person could reasonably say that I had given up hope of ever finding it. That's the basic legal principle. If you can assume that whoever lost it is not looking for it anymore, you get to keep it. If it makes more sense that they are, you don't. Okay. So here is that's the legal discussion. Here's the philosophical question, and has to do with the role of the human mind. All right? Now I'm going to explain this to you, and it may seem familiar to you, it may not, but it might remind you of a more familiar philosophical example of the same issue. The question is, here's a debate in the Talmud between Rava and Abaye, two Talmudic scholars. Yeush shelomi da'at, what they would call unwitting abandonment. Does that count as abandonment or not? Meaning that if you can assume that the person lost the article and stopped looking for it, that you can definitely keep. But what if the person who lost the article does not yet know, doesn't yet realize that they've lost this lost article? Even if you can assume they're going to give up once they know. If they don't know yet, Yeush shelo mida'at, unwitting abandonment. They don't know yet it's lost. Can you keep that? Or does it only count if the person is self-consciously acknowledging that the thing is gone and can't be retrieved? And they have a debate, right? Unwitting abandonment is, Abaye maintains not abandoned it, but Rabbah maintains it is. And they go on to elaborate it. But really, and here we see this relationship between the human dimension of existence and the heavenly, is human acknowledgement, the human mind, human knowing. Is that a necessary element in creating a category of abandonment, lostness? Or is there some larger, a state of being which doesn't require human involvement? Now, what do I mean by a more familiar version of this question? If a tree falls in the forest and no one is there to hear it, does it make a sound? This is the same question. If something is lost, but the person who loses it is not yet aware, does it count as being lost? That is an ontological question insofar as it's asking the question, does human awareness matter as much as, the state of being of the universe or whatever? Now, like I said, that's something that's not explicitly there. That's a philosophical question that emerges out of a lengthy legal question. Let's get to something a little more explicit, all right? Look at text number 3. Text number 3 to get something a little bit more familiar, the question of divine providence versus free will. Now first let me make it clear why I suggest that the question of free will is an ontological question. The question of free will. Do we have the ability, the right to decide our own fate? Or is what we do, is our future, is our destiny choreographed by God? Can you not see that if you say we have entirely free will, it is defining this state of existence one way? But if you say that God, that from that other state of existence, this realm of existence is being affected, that's a different ontological situation. Okay? With that in mind, let's look at text number 3. We have text number 3 is a statement by Rabbi Akiva, our good friend Rabbi Akiva. Look at text number 3. Right? Hakol tzafui, all is foreseen, and freedom of choice is granted. Now those two things seem to be a bit contradictory, right? God foresees everything. God is all-knowing, and if you're Jewish, you have to believe that. God is all-knowing, because that's one of the basic notions of God. But freedom of choice is granted. The world is judged with goodness, but in accordance with the amount of a man's positive deeds. He, Akiva, would also say, everything is placed in pledge, and a net is spread over all the living. The store is open, the shopkeeper extends credit, the account book lies open, like we say on Rosh Hashanah, the hand writes, and all who wish to borrow may come and borrow. Now, what is he saying? Is there free will or is there not? This is a typically Jewish way of thinking. The Jewish way of thinking in the Talmud avoids extreme answers to questions like this. Jews never believed that free will was total, and Jews never believed that free will was absent. Some things there is a significant measure of choice. Through our own decisions we can affect our destiny. But God has foreseen it all. We're still part of some sort of divine plan. Both those things exist side by side. All right? Look at text 3b. Both of these texts, by the way, come from Tractate Avot, Ethics of the Fathers. Okay? This one says, this is Eliezer HaKofer. Now, there's another Hebrew word, kofer, which means heretic. That's kofer with a kaf. This is kofer with a kuf. This is just some guy whose name was Eliezer HaKofer. He taught, let not your heart convince you that the grave is your escape. Okay? Here's the important part. For against your will you are formed. Now, al korchacha ata notzar, against your will you are born, against your will you live, against your will you die, and against your will you are destined to give a judgment and accounting before the King of Kings, the Holy One, blessed is He. So there are 4 parts of life for which we have no free will. We are born, we are conceived against our will, we are born against our will, we live against our will with no free, and we die we die against our will. Now you can read that as, wow, our lives are really prescripted, but the general way of reading that passage is to say those four parts of your life are predetermined by God, but the rest is not. You can read that as a very free will minimal way, but the general way is to say we have a lot of free will. In fact, we have a free will over everything except the fact that eventually we're going to die. By the way, it doesn't say that it's against your will when and how and where you die. The only thing that's against your will is that you die. You know, we didn't choose to be born, right? But the way I see here, between birth and death, nothing is against our will. This is a statement of profound free will, just not total free will. What we have here, as I would suggest in the other 2 cases, is a negotiation between this world and heaven. God is involved in some ways, but God is not involved in other ways. It's almost like a compromise or a moderate, middle of the road, very nice, healthy balance between the two. Okay. Now, we could say much more about ontology, but I think the real interesting part here is epistemology. The difference, but the relationship between revelation and reason. So let's turn to that. Okay. When we look at Talmudic teachings regarding the balance between revelation and reason, we see a progression over a period of about 500, 600, 700 years. Now let's start by saying that initially, that which we knew, that which the children of Israel knew in terms of how God wanted them to act or not act, was defined almost entirely through revelation. The notion is God revealed a series of commandments, a series of instructions to Moses, and that's what the people did. Or that's what they were supposed to do, at least. If they didn't, then they were transgressing. So the balance initially was largely in the direction of revelation. Judaism was almost synonymous with that which had been revealed by God. But consistently, over the years, the balance between that which God instructed, or that which we knew because God told us, versus that which we knew because we figured it out for ourselves, swung in the direction of the latter. All right? And I chose a couple of moments where we see punctuation marks along this trend. Let's look at a couple of examples. Okay? Text number 4. This is a statement in the Talmud talking about the end of prophecy. Now think about it. As long as there were still prophets walking around, then the input of God was still there. As long as there were prophets and you needed to know right and wrong and what does God want us to do in this situation, a prophet could convey the Word of God. And prophecy in that sense was a latter version of revelation. You know? It's sort of not revelation from Sinai, but revelation from heaven. It was an ongoing thing, but it did end eventually. So listen to what they say. Mishemetu nevi'im ha'achronim Chagai, Zechariah, u'Malachi. When the last of the prophets, Chagai, Zechariah, and Malachi, died, Nistalka Ruach HaKodesh miYisrael. The Holy Spirit, the Spirit of God, the Spirit of God ceased to be present in Israel, which is a way of saying revelation stopped for the most part. However, the Adayin hayu mishtamshim bevat kol, but they still made use of a heavenly voice. which is a way of saying, even though the prophets were gone, even though there was no more prophecy, there was no more, grand revelation of some form or another, nonetheless, occasionally, there still would be a heavenly voice which would give counsel. And there are stories in the Talmud where a heavenly voice does actually intervene. I'll give you an example. There were many debates between Hillel and Shammai, and the school of Hillel and Shammai were debating some matter of law. A heavenly voice came down and said, Hillel is right. So there's a period after the end of prophecy where there was still input via a form of revelation called a bat kol, a heavenly voice. But eventually that bat kol disappeared as well. Or the authority and the use of the bat kol, that also began to disappear. And this was made abundantly clear in text 4b. This is a story that might be familiar to you, known as the story of the oven of Achnai, or the debate in the Talmud over the oven of Achnai. And I love this story. It's really one of my favorite, okay? Now, here's the backstory. Again, this is a story which starts in a very mundane legal debate. The oven of Achnai, the question about the oven of Achnai, tell me this isn't the opposite of profound. The question is, could this particular kind of oven be koshered or not? If it became unkosher, could you kosher it? It doesn't get more mundane than that. Nothing sublime, nothing profound. And, well, on one side of this debate, it doesn't even matter which side. On one side of this debate was Rabbi Eliezer, and on the other side of this debate was everybody else. So you got to picture the scene in the Beit Midrash. They're discussing whether or not this oven can be koshered, and Rabbi Eliezer is saying X, and everyone else is saying not X, and they're arguing all day. And what does it say? On that day, by Yom Ha'u, Rabbi Eliezer brought forward every imaginable argument, but the sages did not accept any of them. He's trying to make a legal argument. Now, to this point of the story, this is a story of human intellect against human intellect. Logical inference and deduction, legal thinking against legal thinking. And Eliezer just couldn't convince anyone, but he knew that he was right. He felt that he was right. So finally he said to them, Im halacha kemoti, charuv ze yochiach. If the law is as I say it, he points outside, that carob tree will prove it. And the carob tree picked itself up and walked 100 cubits. And my favorite statement in the Talmud, V'yesh omrim arba'mayot amah, right? And some say it didn't walk 100 cubits, it walked 400 cubits, as if the real point of the story is, how far did the tree miraculously walk? So, but you see, now you would think, you have a legal scholar saying, Eliezer says, if I'm right, that tree is going to do something supernatural, and it did. I think, most of us might believe that. At that point, well, wow, that's miraculous. You predicted a miracle, which, by the way, is the litmus test of prophecy. Being able to predict something supernatural and doing it in the name of defending some law of the Torah. But what's the answer he gets? We don't accept miraculous carob trees as an argument. So he said, if the halacha, im halacha kemoti, if the halacha agrees with me, let the channel of water, amat hamayim, prove it. At that moment, the channel of water flowed backward. The water flowed upstream. Miraculous. And they said, no proof can be brought from a channel of water. You can't bring a proof from a channel of water. Again he said, Im halacha kemoti, kotale beit hamidrash yochichu. The walls of the house of study will prove it. Sure enough, the walls tilted as if to fall. Now here it's getting serious. He's getting frustrated, and whatever ability he has to do this, or whatever coincidence is happening, you would think by this point they start to believe him, because the walls are about to fall on them. At this point, Rabbi Joshua, who's part of the opposition, rebuked the walls, saying, when disciples of the wise are engaged in a halachic dispute, what right have you, miraculously quivering walls, tilting walls, do you have to interfere? Hence, in deference to Rabbi Joshua, they did not fall. And in deference to Rabbi Eliezer, they did not resume their upright position. They are still standing aslant. They just stood there quivering, not knowing, the poor walls, not knowing what to do. Okay, remember the larger point is, You know, we have this supernatural entering the legal discussion and being kept out. Finally, Eliezer is going to play the trump card. What's the trump card? He says to the sages, Im halachat kemoti, mishamayim yochichu. If the law is as I say, the proof will come from heaven. God is going to tell you that I'm right. And what happened at that moment? Sure enough, a bat kol cried out. Remember, the bat kol is this sort of post-prophetic vestige of revelation. Cried out, why do you dispute with Rabbi Eliezer, with whom the halakha always agrees? He's right. God weighs in and says, you know what? Rabbi Eliezer is right. Even if he hasn't proved it to you legally, you know, here's the answer from the back of the book. God says, he's right. All right? Rabbi Joshua stood up and protested. The HaTorah lo bashamayim he. He quotes a verse from the book of Deuteronomy and says, the answer is not in heaven. We pay no attention to a divine voice because long ago at Mount Sinai, you, meaning God, wrote in your Torah at Mount Sinai, acharei rabim lahatot. After the majority, one must incline. Now, that's sort of the end of the story. There's a little footnote we'll get to in a second, but see the story, right? Rabbi Eliezer is invoking the divine authority, the authority of revelation, and in this discussion, the rest of the rabbis are saying, that sort of revelation no longer has anything to do with it. We're done with that kind of revelation. We rely on human reason, human rationality, human legal thinking. This is what we do now. Revelation, schmevelation. We don't go by revelation. Wonderful that all those miraculous things happen. And maybe you are right, Rabbi Eliezer, but if you really were right, if God really was believing that you should be right, then God should have given you the intellectual capacity to prove it. And since you don't have it, since God didn't give it to you, you're wrong. Or even more plainly, who cares what some revelation is going to say? This is how we do things now. Reason, not revelation. This is a profound epistemological moment. Now, parenthetically, it's also a dig at Christianity, because remember, Christianity was based on a notion of this new divine revelation telling everyone how to live, and the rabbis are just casting that aside. But more importantly, this is saying that law is made through legal thinking. Now, it doesn't mean that revelation has ended, but simply redefined, because what the rabbis are also saying here is that the rabbis, we don't hear the will of God or the opinion of God through direct revelation anymore. We infer it from the text which God has given us and from the ability to think which God has given us. It's an indirect way to reveal what God thinks is right, to find the truth, as opposed to a direct way. There's a little coda at the end of the story too, where later on, sometime later, Rabbi Nathan met the prophet Elijah. Now remember, Elijah is at this point, this isn't Elijah Elijah is now a heavenly being. Elijah is the person who ushers in the Messiah. But he may as well be an angel in the story. He met Rabbi Elijah and asked, what did the Holy One do at that moment? This moment when everyone is telling Rabbi Eliezer, we don't care about the bat kol anymore, what did God think? It's an interesting little question. And what did Elijah said? He laughed with joy, saying, Banai nichbashu bi, my children have defeated me. God was ecstatic. God didn't feel defeated. God was proud. God is shepping nachas. I'm so glad that these thinkers have gotten to the point where God doesn't need to tell them what to do anymore. Look how grown up and independent they are. They can fend for themselves. Isn't that wonderful? Obviously, you can see I'm speaking like someone who has children who are 12 and 14 is just reveling in that fact. I totally relate to that story, okay? But this is an important moment, because remember, initially it was all through revelation. Here, while revelation is still important, we understand the will of God. The will of God is revealed through the text or the interpretation of text. It's not as authoritative as it was. And this is a situation where God actually weighed in and they said, yes, God, I know you weighed in, but it's something you said. The answer is not in heaven, is our rationale to ignore what you say. You don't get to weigh in anymore. You have to trust in the fact that we're going to do the right thing without you. Okay? Now, the story doesn't really end there, because the next stage in this development is distinguishing, if at this point the important thing is legal reasoning and rationality, then there's a hierarchy of authority in that realm as well. Because if what matters now is who best can interpret the text, the Torah and subsequent texts as well, well, a hierarchy is eventually created between two groups of scholars. Those scholars of the Talmud and before, and those scholars who came after the Talmud. The term that they use is sof hora'ah, which means the end of teaching or the end of authentic instruction. Okay? And look at text number 4c. Rabbi v'Rabbi Natan, sof mishneh. Okay? Rabbi Yehuda, that's Rabbi, he's simply called the Rabbi, and Rabbi Natan, they mark the end of they are the last of the scholars of the Mishnah, which is one hierarchy of knowledge and authority. Rav Ashi Ravina sof hora'ah. They mark the end of Talmudic legal thinking and authority, which means that anyone who comes after Rav Ashi and Ravina is at a diminished level of legal authority. And anyone who comes before is at an enhanced level of diminished authority. So once we get to the point where it's all about reason and legal thinking, no more about revelation, then a hierarchy there also has to be created. Rashi explains, Rashi has an interesting way of explaining this notion of sof hora'ah on the bottom of page 4. Rashi explains, before Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, the Mishnah was in no systematic order. Each Tana, each scholar of the Mishnah, teaching in which order he desired. Now remember, I said that philosophical thinking is systematic thinking. This notion of sof hora'ah, or this notion of crediting Rabbi Yehuda, the final scholars of the Mishnah, and then Rav Ashi and Ravina, the final scholars of the Gemara, Rashi is going to understand that what they're going to do is bring some systematic order. This is the beginnings of the legal tradition of the Jews being organized in a systematic way, which is an important step towards philosophical thinking. Rabbi compiled and arranged these teachings in a systematized order, admitting those which he considered authentic, etc., etc. It's the beginning of more order and less chaos, which is an important step forward. Okay. So that's the transition in the epistemology of the Talmud from this greater dependence on revelation to a greater dependence on reason and legal thinking. Which brings us to the third of these big three, teleology. This whole question of what do we need to know, why do we do all of this? Now, believe it or not, like I said before, this teleological question of the reason behind the commandments, for a pretty long time, this was not a question of interest. Most of the legal teachings of the Mishnah, and to a point, the legal teachings of the Talmud simply were not interested in the question, why do we do this? They weren't interested in the why. What they were interested in more than anything else is our interpretation of the Torah proper, pure, logical, acceptable? Is this the best way? Their goal, we might say, was interpretation, was exegesis, not understanding the reason why. So when they would study the verses in the Torah which spoke about Shabbat, let's say, they weren't looking for, well, why do we rest on Shabbat, and what is its meaning, and the larger questions that we very often ask these days. What the question they were asking is this sort of work permitted? Is this sort of work not? And what about if there's a form of work which wasn't specifically delineated in the Torah? How do we know if we can do it or not? Really the question they're asking more than anything else is, how do we know? Is this right? Is this a proper interpretation? Is our legal thinking correct? But there is this interesting point of transition somewhere in the Talmud. We don't know exactly when, because we don't know exactly when all these Talmudic scholars lived, but probably sometime around the year 300, 350 CE, maybe, give or take. You know, it's hard to say. Let's look at a couple of texts so we can see this sort of shift, all right? Keeping in mind that originally, the whole goal is interpretation. Now, this transition from the emphasis on interpretation to the emphasis on asking why really grew out of a debate Well, two distinct approaches between two scholars of the Mishnah. One is Rabbi Yishmael, who probably a lesser known guy, and his sort of debate rival was Rabbi Akiva. They had a very different sense of the proper way to read and understand the Torah. Okay? Ishmael's mantra was, look at text number 5, Dibra Torah kilshon b'nei Adam. The Torah speaks in human language. Now, the question is, if the Torah speaks in human language, does that necessitate subsequent generations who read the Torah to interpret the Torah a lot or a little? Only a little. If the Torah is pretty much clear, we don't have to work very hard to really get to the core and the essence of what God is trying to tell us. Akiva believed the opposite. Akiva taught, Dibra Torah bilshon shamayim. The Torah speaks in the language of heaven. We might say they had very different epistemological understandings of how the Torah was written. One, it's very plain and transparent. The other, it's opaque. And Akiva's way, it requires a lot of interpretation. In fact, from Akiva's point of view, the need for interpretation was infinite, and the possibility for interpretation was infinite. All right? So we have these two different approaches. Now, of these two, the followers of both, the followers of Akiva, because their whole endeavor of interpretation was so much more vast and complex, they were the ones who eventually gravitated in the direction of the why. For Ishmael, the whole thing was very plain. We don't need to ask why, because it's very clear what we're supposed to do. But it's the Akiva approach, when the actual meaning is unclear, the question why, in part, helps to elucidate or clarify what this opaque teaching is actually trying to tell us. But early on, there is this reluctance to engage in the whole endeavor of what comes to be known Ta'amei HaMitzvot, the purpose of the commandments. Look at text number 6a. Okay? Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Mipnei ma lo nitgalu Ta'amei Torah. Why were the reasons for the commandments of the Torah not revealed? Why doesn't the Torah say? This is the question. Why, when the Torah says we have to observe Shabbat, there's a vague reason, you came out of Egypt so that you can. There's not that much in terms of an explanation. Why are, kashrut? No explanation at all. Shatnez, mixing linen and wool, or why? There are lots of commandments unexplained. Or the explanation is, because I am the Lord your God. End of explanation. Why? Okay? Here is an answer of why. Rabbi Isaac taught, what were the reasons for the Torah not being revealed? Because of two stories in the Torah in which the reason was revealed and caused a great person to fail. Now, he said there are two stories. The Talmud only records one of these examples. So he's going to give an example of a situation where the reason for a commandment in the Torah was indeed revealed, an exception, and it led someone astray. In this case, it led Solomon astray. Remember, Solomon being the ultimate, I was about to say he was the ultimate wise guy, but he's the ultimate wise person. Okay? Solomon the wise. It was written, there's a verse in the book of Deuteronomy which says, Lo yarbelo nashim. A king should not have multiple wives. Now, we know that King Solomon clearly ignored that injunction because he had 300 wives and 700 concubines. So the question is, why? Why did he do that? Because Solomon said, I will have many wives and it will not be forbidden. The notion is that Solomon came up with a rationale. Solomon believed that the reason for that injunction was not the number of wives, but the kind of wives. When the Bible said, don't have too many wives, it meant don't have too many wives who are going to lead you astray. If you have good wives, not only are going to help you, but are going to be, make sure you don't bring in foreign gods and idols, you can have as many as you want. That was Solomon's rationale. And what ultimately happened to Solomon, and here Rabbi Yitzchak quotes another verse from the book of Kings, Vayihi le'et zignat Shlomo nashav hitu et levavo. When he grew old, his wives corrupted his heart. We know that Solomon's wives all convinced him to fill Jerusalem with foreign idols and temples, which caused all kinds of problems. So the notion is Solomon knew the reason, or Solomon intuited the reason, and led astray. This is the rationale for not giving rationales. This is the reason why we, early on in the Talmud, we're not going to concern ourselves with the why. We're only going to concern ourselves with the what and the how and anything but the why. All right. 6b is sort of the follow-up. All right. They're going to discuss. They're going to try to. They're going to try to sort of second guess what Solomon was thinking. All right. So in the Mishnah in Sanhedrin, he shall not take many wives. This means more than 18. They sort of came up with the number 18 wives. The reason 18 is that King David had 18 wives. None of his wives led him astray. So, the problem lies somewhere between 18 and 300. So, just to be safe, let's cap it off at 18 wives. Several centuries later, a couple of thousand years later, that number 18 would be reduced to 1. But for now, until the 9th or 10th century CE, the number of wives legally allowed to a Jew was 18. Then that came later. Okay. Rabbi Yehuda says, he may take as many wives as he wants, provided they do not turn his heart away from God. Now, this is a very interesting teleological disagreement. They're asking, what is the underlying reason behind this whole notion of not having too many wives? And Rabbi Yehuda is saying, he's sort of second-guessing Solomon's reasoning. It's not about the number of wives, it's about the kind of wives. Rabbi Shimon says, he should not marry even one who will turn his heart away. If it's the wrong wife, it's someone who's going to corrupt him, it shouldn't even be 1, let alone 18. If so, Rabbi Shimon was asked, why the verse, he shall not have many wives? He explained, even if the many wives were like Abigail. Abigail's a good wife. So this is an early exercise in Ta'amei HaMitzvot. All right? It gets a little more interesting when we begin to move forward. We have emerging in the Talmud 2 competing forms of looking for the answer. One is interpretation, and one is what the Talmud is going to call bitzua, which means arbitration. Now, arbitration here means not arbitrary. Arbitration means 2 judges, 2 jurists, 2 legal scholars using their own legal intellect to disagree or to come to a legal conclusion. And being less worried about whether or not the conclusion can be rooted in some sort of, how good the interpretation is. Look at text number 7. Rabbi Eliezer, the son of Rabbi Yossi HaGalili, Yossi the Galilean, says that it is forbidden to arbitrate. This guy says, Rabbi Eliezer says, the only proper way to understand law is through proper interpretive technique. You can't come up with your own conclusion. All you can do is interpret, no arbitrating. Rather, the law should pierce the mountain, which is a way of saying the only way to arrive at the proper conclusion, understand what God wants, is through proper interpretation. Ki hamishpat le'Elohim hu, for judgment is God's. All right? That's one side of this. That's one side of this debate between interpretation and arbitration. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Korcha says that arbitration is meritorious. Mitzvah livtzoa. It's a commandment. It's meritorious to arbitrate, as is written. And he quotes a verse from the book of Zechariah: a true and harmonious judgment you shall judge in your gates. And they ask a very interesting question here. Because Zechariah, the prophet, said you have to pursue harmony and judgment. Harmony and justice. Okay? And I love this question. Is it not so that where there is justice, there is no harmony, and where there is harmony, there is no justice? If all you're trying to do is interpret earlier verses and teachings, there's no way you're going to find something which is a legitimate interpretation that's going to make everybody happy. You just can't do it. Either everyone's going to agree that it's legitimate, but not everyone's going to like it, or everyone's going to like it, and not everyone's going to agree that it's a legitimate interpretation. So they ask a very question: Ezehu mishpat sheyesh bo shalom have omer ze bitzua. What kind of justice contains harmony? That is arbitration. Now, this is a statement which says that arbitration is the proper way to go. Now, one of the things they're going to infer here is that this whole enterprise of arbitration, of not simply interpreting, necessitates the asking of the question, what is the purpose of the commandment? Why? For someone to come up with an original interpretation You can't simply say, I base my interpretation on a reading of this verse. But it's going to necessitate some larger thinking. All right? And this shift away from simply interpreting to coming up with original legal thinking and asking this larger question of why, at some points it becomes even more overt and more plain. All right? There's a discussion in the Mishnah and in the Talmud. This is in text number 8. It's a very interesting question. The question is, remember, this is the point where the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, is being canonized. The rabbis are deciding which books should be included in the Tanakh and which books should not. Now you should know, parenthetically, not all of these ancient books were included. Like the book of Maccabees was excluded from the Tanakh. But the big question came. The big question was, should the book of Esther be included in the Tanakh or not? Now, look, we know what the answer is, obviously. We read the book of Esther. It's included in every version of the Hebrew Bible. But of all the books of the Bible, other than the book of Daniel, there was more debate about whether or not to include the book of Esther. And one of the big problems was it's a very undivine book. There isn't a lot of God in the book. It's a very, you might call it a secular book. It's a very human, secular story. So it wasn't clear, all right? Look at text number 8. Now, in this section, there's a whole series, in the Talmud, there's a whole series of rationalizations post facto as to why it was correct to include the book of Esther, at which point Samuel, who was a transitional scholar between the Mishnah and the Talmud, he said, and you know, if you're thinking he's a bit presumptuous and arrogant here, correct. Had I been there when they were deciding whether or not to include the book of Esther. Remember, this is after a whole series of rationalizations by rabbis who lived generations before he did. Had I been there, I would have given a proof superior to all, namely that it says, Kimu v'kiblu alehem. They confirmed and took upon them the teachings, the instruction, the story of Esther. That's a verse from the book of Esther, which means they confirmed above what they took upon themselves below, which is a way of saying the reason the book of Esther is included in the Tanakh is because the Jews themselves said, you know what, we are going to include the book of Esther in the Tanakh, and heaven agreed. You don't need all these proof texts and interpretive gymnastics to justify the inclusion of the book of Esther. Esther is included because the Jews decided to include it, or the rabbis decided to include it, and that's a good enough explanation. In response to this, Rava said, and remember, Rava is the major advocate of arbitration, of that form of legal thinking, apart from interpretation. Rava said, all the proofs that can be confuted, except that of Samuel, which cannot be concluded. He's right. The best answer as to why the book of Esther is included cannot be found by justifying it in terms of a particular verse. The best answer is it was through the arbitration and the contemplation of Jewish legal scholars. All right? Let me look at one last text and then we'll conclude here, okay? Which gives us a sense of this new way of thinking, which is going to place a greater premium on asking the question why, all right? Now, this comes from Tractate Brachot, and it's really talking about this whole endeavor of looking for the teleology, looking for the why. It's following on a whole discussion as to what it means to find the reason for something. What it means is this. The rule, a particular commandment, is based upon a reason and not upon an argument a fortiori. For if we were to employ here an argument a fortiori, it would be one which could not be rebutted. A fortiori is the word for kal v'chomer, which is an older form of interpretation of a biblical verse or an earlier teaching. What this statement is saying that the best way or the surest way to defend the legitimacy of a particular ruling is not through a contest of interpretation. Because if all it is a series of competing interpretations, the argument goes, you can't rebut something. If someone says, what I believe is right because of this verse, because I'm reading this verse, ultimately, unless you can show that the reading of the verse is not proper, you can't reject that because you'll be rejecting the proof text as well. So this teaching right here is saying we shouldn't have too much emphasis on proof texts. What we need is to have clear legal reasoning. So in the same way that earlier on, the authority and the legal thinking of the scholars superseded revelation, here is the next stage. Remember we said the later form of revelation was inferring from text. Here, the Talmud is saying, yes, that's an important later version or form of indirect revelation, but we don't want to be tied too much by that. We don't want the legal discussions or the search for truth in Judaism, the search for meaning, to come down to one interpretation versus another, because that's just going to be a series of stalemates. We have to be able to use this technique of bitzua, of arbitration. So where does that leave us? In the end, when the period of the Talmud closes, there's still no philosophical work. There's still no systematic Jewish philosophical text. There's no section talking about philosophy. But we do have this loose collection of philosophical ideas. What it's going to do is going to make possible for subsequent generations of Jewish scholars, when they do begin to think in more systematic and specifically rational ways, and they want to create a philosophy of Judaism, they're going to be able to use the philosophical foundation laid in the Talmud by the rabbis of the Talmud, and from that to construct more systematic philosophy, and that we'll turn to next week. Thank you very much.